Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Guy Midkiff. Today is June. Let's make that August the 27th, 2013. And I'm quite lucky to be interviewing Bernie Hillermann today, who is a Korean War veteran. Bernie, could you introduce yourself with your full name, when you were born?
I'm Bernie A. Hillermann, born in Washington, Missouri in January of 1932.
And what were the names of your parents and brothers and sisters?
My dad was Bernie E. Hillermann. My mother was Margaret Hillermann Schrader. My brother was Don Hillermann. My sisters were Theola, Joanne, Bernadette, and Doris.
And what high school did you attend, Bernie?
St. Francis Borgia.
Did you play any sports?
There was very little sports when I went to high school. There was no football there yet. And the way the program was, there was no way I could play basketball. We played softball, but basketball was out due to the schedule. I had a full-time job by that time.
What kind of work were you doing?
Believe it or not, World War II was still going, and at the age of 12, I was on a production line in downtown Washington, the Washington Planing Mill, who had a contract of making boxes out of solid wood for the U.S. government to put beer in and send overseas. And I got paid. We worked the whole summer while school was down that summer. We worked 10 hours a day. We got 10 cents an hour, and I worked 60 hours a week for $6.
Why don't you repeat again how old you were when you were doing that?
I was 12.
Now, we have two children in the audience today. We have Kyle and Caitlin. Caitlin, you're 11. Imagine. One more year from now working like that. Okay? Now, what did you do anything for fun?
Well, it was wartime by that time. Sure, we had lots of fun. We did everything. Back then, it isn't like it is today. We wasn't afraid to go anywhere in Washington on our bike, walking, running, whatever. Walking was something we all did very often. My grandparents lived west of Washington, 5 miles, and we wouldn't think anything of walking out there in the morning and come home again that night.
What was your one favorite thing that you really liked to do most with your friends, the guys?
That I can't.
Did you do any hunting?
Did a lot of hunting. When I was young, we hunted in the wintertime rabbits naturally, and in the summertime squirrels. Back then, there was no deer here or turkey, none whatsoever in our area. So they had to come much later. There was quail, but there again, the season didn't allow me to do much quail hunting.
Now, at age 12, were you very aware of what was going on in World War II?
Well, yes, because my dad was very, very attentive to the war. And every night when the news time came on, we had blackouts here in Washington. There was a lot of times you couldn't have any lights on in the house except we had a big box radio, but the radio itself in there wasn't very big. And that was all important. Everybody had to be quiet when that news came on about the war. And my parents were German heritage. My dad actually went to school with German books right here in Washington, Missouri. Never had English books. And he graduated after 6 years. He was done with school. And he was a whip bang with adding. You ought to have seen him, but he was sharp.
Pretty good.
And the war was just preoccupied all of us. I mean, it was just we was collecting anything that could be collected. There was no waste back then, and we would take it behind Borgia High School, which back then was a scrap iron company, and I'd seen piles there. It looked like a big haystack. It was that big of things that kids his age would come in with a wagon full of trash. Even toothpaste holders back then were made out of aluminum, so everything was recycled.
So everybody felt a part of the war.
Oh, big time.
You all felt like you're on the same team.
That was our life. That's right.
Did you have a brother that was in World War II?
Yes, my brother was in the Navy also.
What can you tell me about him?
he was scared to death of the water. How he ever got in the Navy, I'm not real sure. But one time they got caught in a typhoon, and he was on a heavy cruiser, and it actually was so bad and so rough that it tore off 107 feet of the bow of that ship. And they all made it, and they saved the ship and made it back to Pearl Harbor to get it repaired. And that was during the war.
Was that the one where they lost the 3 ships? Bull Halsey lost 3 ships in the Philippine Sea, and he almost got court-martialed over that. That was really bad. But there were some big bad storms, and knowing that, you were still interested in going into the Navy.
Oh yeah, there was no doubt in my mind about that. That's a long story by itself. When I went into the Navy, I can talk about that in a little bit.
Sure. But that did influence you to some degree, knowing that your brother was.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
No doubt about it. So that kind of answers the question of why you chose the Navy. Your brother had something to do with that. I got a feeling.
Yes, he was in there 3.5 years also.
Did you get letters from him or your mom?
Oh,
and dad?
sure. Yeah, my mom used to write every day.
Did he talk much about World War II when he got back?
At first, but not really. You know, veterans are a little bit different, and I'm talking here to singing to the choir, I guess you might say, but there was just a lot of times you don't talk about it because you're talking over the head to the person you're talking to, and he thinks you're blowing smoke or just, they just, how can you comprehend of me riding on that ship unless you've seen that picture? Now, you are a veteran, but that's very, very difficult to explain. When I first showed it to my own children, they thought I was on a Caribbean cruise when I was in the Navy. Until I showed them that film, it's just a little different.
Now, how did you feel when the World War II vets came home?
It was a lot different than when I came home. Nobody but my parents was glad to see me come home from the Korean War. Yeah. Everybody was burnt out. It was only 5 years from the Second World War. Second World War was the big war, naturally, and there was so many people involved in all ages, whether they were home or in the service. They all were taking part in the war. So it was quite a celebration right here in Washington. Downtown was overwhelmed.
What did they do in the celebration? Did they throw paper mache out the window, or I had no idea what I'm sure there was no beer drinking going on. Surely not.
There was plenty of beer around back then too. And regardless of who you was, everybody kissed each other. I mean, they was partying big time.
All right. Who was your hero, either sports or military hero from the World War II period when you were in high school? General
Patton. I can't tell you how many times, and I'm not a movie goer. I ain't been to the movie here in Washington, Missouri in 5 years. But I watched General Patton many times. I loved that movie. I thought he was the best guy ever.
Let's move on to the enlistment and what was going on when you decided to go into the Navy. Did you? It seemed like I remember you telling me in the pre-interview that there were a couple of your buddies that decided. How did that whole process unfold?
Well, we talked about it in a long time. There wasn't a lot to do back then in Washington. World War II was over 4 or 5 years, and it was you had shoe factories was the #1 employment here. There was other things, but not easy to get into. Like Union Electric was good, but it was very difficult because they had all the help they needed. But anyway, getting back to the shoe factory, there was several thousand worked at International Shoe Factory, which the building is still out there today. And that I worked there for a while too before I enlisted, but we talked about it for a long time. I wanted to enlist earlier, and my mother wouldn't sign the papers to let me go at 17.
Why do you think that was?
Well, because of my brother's experience. He come home and talked about the bad times they had and the rough, etc., but it didn't make me any difference. So I was 18 in January, and I enlisted in January. I was gone. But anyway, there was 12 of us went down to enlist, and the building is still there, the federal building where everybody went. And there was only 3 out of the 12 of us that passed. And there were just little things like their eyesight wasn't perfect and didn't have glasses, had a few teeth that might need filling and whatever, then you wouldn't pass. But the 3 of us that did pass, that was January, their complement was full, so we didn't get in January. I had to wait until March, and I went in March, and we wasn't prepared for a war, I'll tell you that. And I went to San Diego for my boot training. Today boot training is only 8 weeks. Ours back then was 13 because he didn't know what to do with us, so he was just disciplined. But we didn't train for the war whatsoever. I never did any combat training.
So when you left Washington, what'd you do? You got on the bus and you went to St. Louis and
I
then
went to St. Louis by the bus, and then when we was drafted, they sent us by train to San Diego 3 days.
What was that train ride like?
Oh, the train was okay, but it was a long, drawn-out affair. I tell you, it was 3 days getting to San Diego.
Were you with any of your buddies on the train? Or
No, they separated us.
Yeah.
The minute we got in the service, there wasn't a one with me. There was only 3 of us that went in, but it was all different. And while I was home on boot leave, which was June, I was to go back to San Diego for schooling and not knowing what it would be, and they didn't either yet. But while I was home, the war broke out. It broke out, the 25th of June in 1950. I got a telegram from the Navy saying that when I went back to San Diego, I should report to the Brinkley Bass. And that's where you see the difference. The picture you got is before, and when I got out there, it was in dry dock, and they was doing a major update. And that's when they added the guns, and the mast was changed from a single to a tripod, and it was the new modern up to destroyer. So the fastest we could get that thing ready to go, they had civilians on it working everywhere, and plus all of us people. It was August. We took off for Korea, and they were so anxious to get there. We followed the Boxer. Believe it or not, they would put the planes on the deck and run the propellers to help the Boxer make better speed. And we went from California, San Diego to Pearl Harbor, from Pearl Harbor to Midway, and from Midway to Japan, and then from Japan to Korea. So we only stopped each time long enough to refuel, take on supplies, etc.
So you didn't get off the ship in Pearl Harbor?
Well, we did the first night. Each night you got a few divided up in thirds.
What did you guys typically do when you got shore leave?
Well, when it's the first time, you was kind of like going to the skyscraper for the very first time. When you get to Hawaii, born and raised here and never had been there before, was quite a fantasy land. So it kept us pretty busy. But we was only there a day.